Good morning, everyone. Wherever you are in the world, I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe. Thank you for joining the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center and the Center for Houston's Future for this timely discussion on potential green stimulus in the wake of COVID-19 and on the role of the oil and gas industry in the energy transition. My name is Randy Bell, and I'm the director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. Today's conversation comes in the midst of an unprecedented period of market volatility in the energy industry, which has been especially hard hit by the COVID-19 crisis. But even before the pandemic began, the industry was facing mounting societal pressure to transition away from fossil fuel production and towards cleaner energy technologies, technologies such as carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, and measures such as methane abatement and energy efficiency enhancements. They've all been discussed as pathways for oil and gas companies to decarbonize and eventually transition to a lower carbon future. But also as areas in which the industry can take the lead and contribute to the energy transition by bringing essential technologies to market faster. Global Energy Center published a major report earlier this year on these issues called The Role of Oil and Gas Companies in the Energy Transition. And one of our panelists, RJ Johnson, co-authored. And I'm interested to see how our panelists think that the transition has been impacted by the pandemic and what they think of the potential role for a green stimulus in spurring it. I'd also like to introduce today's moderator, Julia Piper, a senior fellow here at the GEC and a senior editor at Green Tech Media, as well as the co-host of the energy and environment podcast, Political Climate. As this event is entirely virtual, if you are interested in asking questions during the Q&A period, please submit the questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We also encourage you to follow the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center on Twitter at AC Global Energy and the Center for Houston's Future at Future Houston. Thank you to Brett Perlman and the team at the Center for Houston's Future for working with us to put this event together. We held a workshop on oil and gas company transitions with CHF last year, and it's been a pleasure to work with them again on this event. I'll now hand it off to Brett to make a few remarks before we get started.
Thanks, Randy. For those of you who don't know us, the Center for Houston's Future is a nonprofit that works to bring together business, government, and community stakeholders in fact-based strategic planning and collaboration on issues of the greatest importance to the future of the Houston region. The Center is currently working on a project to re-envision Houston as a global leader in the low-carbon energy economy. And as part of that work, we've been hosting a series of webcasts focused on educating and raising awareness on climate change and the need to accelerate the speed of the energy transition. So today we're pleased to work with the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center on how green stimulus investments can spur efforts of oil and gas companies to advance the low carbon energy transition. I'd like to thank Randy and turn it over to our moderator, who is host of my favorite podcast, Political Climate, at the Schwarzenegger Center, Julia Piper. Julia?
Great. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And a small plug for Political Climate. We have John Podesta, a seasoned Democratic operative, on our podcast this week. So tune in tomorrow if you're interested in hearing that. On this live event, we are going to talk about the concept of a green stimulus, what could and should be in it, and as was just mentioned, the role that the oil and gas industry can play in transitioning to a lower carbon economy. So I'm joined in this conversation by Gavin Dillingham. He's the Clean Energy Policy Program Director at the Houston Advanced Research Center. Also, Cindy Yielding, Senior Vice President at BP America, as well as Alex Dewar, Senior Director at the Center for Energy Impact at Boston Consulting Group, and RJ Johnson, Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center and Managing Director for Energy, Climate, and Resources at Eurasia Group. So let's jump right in. Gavin, I'd like to start with you because HARC is based in Houston and we're having a Texas-focused conversation in part today. So begin by giving us a little bit more detail on your work at HARC, but then to jump right into our conversation, give us a brief overview of how you're thinking about the intersection of a green stimulus in the wake of COVID-19 and how that could spur efforts of the oil and gas industry to advance the low-carbon energy transition, and maybe how this would affect Houston specifically. So take a few minutes to answer that, and then we'll go to our other panelists. Thank you.
Great joining everyone here today. Thank you for the opportunity to join this great panel. I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation. So the Houston Advanced Research Center, also known as HARC, is a research institute located in the Woodlands, just north of Houston. And we focus on a variety of air, energy, and water type issues, sustainability type research questions, really focused in Texas as well as along the Texas Gulf Coast. Most of the work that I focus on is more on the clean energy side, decarbonization of the grid, as well as energy resilience, how to improve the resilience of our power sector as we witness a growing number of extreme weather events. And so we do a lot of work with developing and working as a research management organization where we build and bring together large teams, large groups of collaborators to kind of answer some of these more difficult questions. Some of the work we're looking at right now is really developing a model that allows us to downscale climate risk, both transitional risk and physical climate risk impacts to the power sector across the United States. So I'm very excited to be here and have this opportunity. So to kind of respond to your first question here, really what we're looking at is, when we're looking at in respect to COVID-19 and the green stimulus, we really need to be looking at things that can help on the near term. There's been a significant amount of job losses. So we need to look at the near-term recovery as well as mid and long-term industry change and kind of that decarbonization energy transition effort. Much in line with kind of what we're discussing today, there's actually 3 articles in the Houston Chronicle that kind of point directly to this need for stimulus and change in the market. One was focused specifically on kind of a contrasting between Tesla and ExxonMobil, the amount of research and development activity that's happening focused on decarbonization, as well as one company that's focusing more on kind of maintaining the status quo to some degree, and how are those going to come out in the end. A couple other articles, the other 2 articles really focused on suggesting that maybe the status quo is not ideal. There needs to be a more rapid transition happening. There needs to be a greater movement forward. And one focused more specifically on banks reducing investment in oil and gas and de-risking their balance sheets. The other talked more specifically in climate risk in general, both transition risk, which is decarbonization and the impacts that could happen there, as well as growing wariness of investors. BlackRock, as many of you probably know, made these significant investment or announcements about pulling back in some of their investments or wanting greater disclosure of physical climate risk, and so largely extreme weather risk, both chronic and long-term type risks happening to the portfolios that they manage and monitor as such. So really just interesting to see that happening in the Chronicle this morning, just very apropos to what we're looking at today. A lot of the discussion today is going to be focusing largely on greenhouse gas mitigation and the use of stimulus dollars to help with decarbonization and the energy transition. There's 2 things that I really want to continue to emphasize: that anything that comes out that's going to be a green stimulus really needs to look at physical climate risk to some degree. It's a growing issue. It's a growing concern. You look at the recent data coming out of NOAA about billion-dollar disaster events already in 2020. As of this month, there's been 10 climate disaster extreme weather events that over $1 billion in the United States. When you look at the trends over the last couple decades, well, since 1980 to 2019, we've seen about 6 to 7 of these extreme weather events happening. When you just look at 2015 to 2019, there's been on average 14 of these billion-dollar events. And so we're seeing these in growing amount of extreme weather risk happening here. And we really need to, as we transition our economy and look to ways in which to decarbonize, make sure we're looking at both the greenhouse gas mitigation and the physical climate risk side of things. The other, just last piece here I want to cover here is just really discussing how, when we make this decarbonization, how when we make this energy transition, we focus on just transition. We focus on the employees, the people that are involved in this industry, and making sure that they have an opportunity to participate, especially when you're looking at skilled labor, kind of the blue collar folks that are out there on the oil rigs, that are out there working with oil field services, that are out there doing the implementation, the construction. Make sure that we're developing an economy that they can participate in. Make sure we're developing workforce training, workforce opportunities that allows them to prosper and continue to prosper. So just kind of want to open up in that regard. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for those overarching comments. And yeah, I understand it's quite hot in Houston right now, which has created actually some concern around COVID, right? It's hard to stay inside if you don't have proper cooling and things like that. And so outside is hot. So there's an intersection of all of these issues for sure. Cindy, I'd love to go to you next to hear BP's perspective. In February, there was a huge announcement that BP CEO Bernard Looney announced that the company will reorganize its traditional upstream and downstream business structure and reorient around achieving a net zero target by 2050. You have a wealth of experience working in the oil and gas industry. Tell us a little bit more about your experience here and the issues that you're working on now. I understand you're on the leading edge of this. And so to tee up our discussion, build on what I just mentioned there and that announcement in February, and what exactly is BP trying to do here?
Okay, so first of all, hi Julia, thank you for having us and including me and BP in today's panel. So kind of BP in a nutshell, in February, as you said, we announced a new purpose, reimagining energy for people on our planet. And to make this purpose a reality, we've adopted the ambition to be a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world get to net zero carbon. So this will mean tackling about 450 million tons of emissions, 55 million from our operations, and 360 million tons of carbon content from our upstream oil and gas production. So just a little bit more kind of nerdy detail here, but our ambition is underpinned by 10 aims. We believe these 10 aims, taken together as a package, set us out on a path that's consistent with the Paris goals and with our new purpose. So I'm going to go through these really quickly, so bear with me. Aims 1 through 5 are to get BP to net zero. These aims include for BP to be net zero across our entire operations on an absolute basis by 2050 or sooner. Our second aim is to be net zero on an absolute basis across the carbon in our upstream oil and gas production by 2050 or sooner. Those were the two numbers I referenced earlier. Our third aim is to cut the carbon intensity of the products we sell by 50% by 2050 or sooner. Our fourth aim is focused on methane. We'll install methane measurement at all our major existing oil and gas operations and processing sites by 2023, publish the data, and drive a 50% reduction in methane intensity in these operations. Our final sort of BP-focused aim is to get to increase the proportion of investments that we make into our non-oil and gas businesses. So then aims 6 through 10 are really about helping the world get to net zero carbon. And they include a more active advocacy for policies that support net zero, including carbon pricing, incentivizing our global workforce to deliver on our aims, for them to also be advocates for net zero. That's through compensation. Our eighth aim, setting new expectations for our relationships with trade associations. 9 is leading in transparency of our reporting. We feel like that's very important for some of the reasons that Gavin referenced earlier on people watching and the focus of investors. And then finally, and this is one of my favorite aims, we've created a new team to develop integrated clean energy and mobility solutions for cities and regions. So as I mentioned, we launched this new purpose and ambition in February, and we just stood up the new structure the 1st of July. We're planning to share more on the strategy and some more detail behind each of these aims and how we'll deliver on our ambition as part of our Capital Markets Day in September.
Fantastic. Thanks for running through that. All right, Alex, I'd like to go to you next. Oil and gas companies are facing mounting societal pressure to better address the threat of climate change. You recently wrote for the Atlantic Council's Energy Source blog that, quote, in discussions about COVID-19, economic recovery policies, any measures focused on the oil and gas industry are often portrayed as being at odds with a green stimulus. Take a minute to describe your role at Boston Consulting Group, if that would help set us up here, and then dive right into that comment. What did you mean when you wrote that a green stimulus within the oil and gas industry is not necessarily a contradiction in terms?
Thanks, Julia, and thanks so much to Brett and Randy for organizing the panel today on this really critical topic. So just by way of background, I work at BCG's Center for Energy Impact in Washington, D.C., and one of our central jobs really is to work with our clients globally to navigate energy transitions through an understanding of how technology, policy, and market and consumer trends will shape the future of energy. And with that, we really work with clients to identify commercial opportunities for our private sector clients, as well as many of our public sector clients focused on how to promote competitiveness going forward through the energy transition. And really to answer your question, I think our central focus in many ways since March has really been trying to understand how COVID-19 will impact energy transitions in different ways. Ultimately, whether it will be a force that can help to accelerate energy transitions or slow them. And I think what we've found in the US in particular is that there is a real risk that the health, social, and economic impacts coming out of COVID-19 can really destroy or undermine at least governments and private sector's economic capacity to promote energy transitions. Because what we know is that to deploy clean energy is a very capital intensive process, and you need economic stability and capacity to do that. So as the US is very much sort of still grappling with this, grappling with the immediate health and human impacts and the high unemployment coming out of COVID-19, what we've been looking at is where are there areas in the short run that can help to promote employment while also contributing to material emissions reductions. I think a lot of focus is paid toward long-term investments, R&D, of course, and accelerating new technologies for the long term. But the first wave of stimulus in many ways needs to be focused on the real human impacts and promoting employment, stabilizing employment at least. And within that sort of dimension or ways of thinking about it, we really have identified three areas in particular where we think the oil and gas industry can play a role, both in terms of achieving those two goals, right, of stabilizing employment and reducing emissions in the near term. First is in methane emissions. We have all seen the news. This is a very material and has been growing source of greenhouse gas emissions in the US. So I think even modest investments around plugging orphaned wells, as well as helping to kick off more systematic monitoring of methane emissions from our natural gas supply chains is, a quick win on both fronts. Second, energy efficiency. We've seen in other instances how it can be a great promoter of job development. And we know that there's also tremendous opportunity, particularly in downstream oil and gas operations, to promote energy investment and reduce emissions from that front. And then third, focusing on carbon capture, use, and storage. There is a tremendous queue of projects actually lining up to go forward in the coming years, given the 45Q tax credit that's been adopted. So even some modest measures there to help accelerate the development and deployment of those projects, I think could really provide a boost in the short run, while also, of course, providing very material emissions reductions. So that's our view. It's really oriented around I'd say quite a pragmatic one in the near term here of employment, of jobs, stabilizing the economy, and capturing emissions benefits where the oil and gas industry can really play a role to reduce emissions in the near term here, while of course setting up a longer term platform for, I'd say, more sustainable growth of stabilizing the oil and gas industry and helping the industry helping to bring down emissions for the long run.
Great. Just as a note of context, a new World Bank report came out, I believe just this week, talking about global methane emissions. They're actually on the rise. And so that's not just here in the US, but it does show this opportunity for the US to perhaps work globally in tackling that issue. So if anyone's interested in that, direct you to the World Bank for more. RJ, now to you to round out our initial comments. Please describe your role at Eurasia Group a little bit more for our audience. And then I'd like to give you the question I gave to Gavin at the beginning. How are you thinking about the intersection of a green stimulus in the wake of COVID-19 and how it could spur efforts of oil and gas companies to decarbonize?
Sure. So I'm the managing director for the Energy, Climate, and Resources practice at Eurasia Group, which is a geopolitical risk advisory firm based in New York. And we actually rebranded our practice to the name Energy, Climate, and Resources at the beginning of this year because we were getting so much interest from clients, not just in traditional oil and gas geopolitics, but in issues like we're discussing today around the energy transition, and climate policy, sustainable finance, So really, honestly, a lot of our consulting work, as others mentioned, the panel is being driven by those kind of questions that we're discussing today. So we have analysts covering, I don't know, 100 countries around the world, pretty much all the major oil and gas producers and consumers. We work both with the industry, the production side, upstream, downstream, as well as the financial investors that provide capital to the industry. And I think I would focus on that last piece in answering your question, which is, even though Eurasia Group is political science and international relations and focused on governments, I think that a lot of the interesting things in the decarbonization front and energy transition are happening in the capital markets, right? That I think that the capital markets are actually moving a lot faster than governments, not just in the US, where obviously the Trump administration has been fairly indifferent to this issue, but even in the European Union, where capital markets are a key part of the new taxonomy that Brussels is building to support the energy transition, influencing a lot of the key companies based in Europe, all along the energy value chain. And I think that what we're seeing is, from a capital markets perspective in green stimulus, I would say there's a lot more potential to tap into capital markets and private markets than there is into government. Right? I think government will play a niche role, and certainly in countries like China, where the command and control economy will play a big role. But I think unlocking the power of the big banks, the big asset managers, insurance companies, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, all of which are really increasing their focus on decarbonization and looking for projects to deploy their capital to support the energy transition. Now, why are they doing that? Mostly it's not because governments are telling them to, although in some places like maybe Europe they are. It's because they see business opportunities and they see business risks, right? The opportunities really are to build a portfolio of sustainable finance projects, whether it's green bonds, whether it's project finance, whether it's portfolios of the publicly traded assets that have a green flavor. That's what the customers are looking for. So yes, regulators and policymakers are shaping this, but I think the customer demand for financial products that support the energy transition is extremely high. So then the challenge becomes, as Cindy suggested, how can the legacy oil and gas companies tap into those very large funding pools, right? Which frankly are much larger than they are for traditional oil and gas. And we talked about COVID, but let's not forget that even before COVID, the traditional upstream sector was struggling to raise capital with very few exceptions. Now, in the midst of COVID, it's an even greater struggle. I would argue that the green stimulus side is the exact opposite. There's actually far more capital than there is investable projects. So I think the work that everyone on this call is doing to create a pipeline of projects, whether it's early stage or more mature, is going to be well received by the financial community.
Great. I'm going to cycle through several of my questions, and then the audience, please feel free to ask your own question in the Q&A. We'll start circling back to those a little later in the conversation. I want to go back to Gavin first and look at Texas again a little more closely. It is a huge player in the renewable energy sector, obviously also in the oil and gas sector. I'm wondering what opportunities you see a little more specifically for an even greater role for Houston and Texas in this clean energy economy as you would define it. How would you flesh that out a little bit?
Absolutely. There is significant and growing opportunity within the state, especially when you're looking at wind, solar, as well as storage opportunities there. A lot of the activity is actually coming out of Houston. A lot of the development activity, funding activity, trading, all comes out of Houston. And so we have a very solid base within the city itself and Texas generally. Also, when you look at kind of expanding out the renewable energy opportunities within the state, there has to be some significant investment and focus in some particular areas. One of the issues that are right now limiting some of the development within the state, especially around wind, is the amount of congestion that's on the transmission distribution lines. There were these competitive renewable energy zone lines, transmission distribution lines that were created and built several years ago that really allowed for the wind market to develop and bring the wind from West Texas into the urban centers of the state. There's now significant congestion on those. There needs to be a growing emphasis on how do we reduce congestion and allow the increasing capacity to happen out there. To kind of offset some of that congestion, you're seeing solar, which has a different kind of usage profile than wind does, and so we're seing a lot more storage going out there. But soon, that could lead to capacity issues. as well. And so there needs to be just greater investment in the transmission distribution infrastructure, just greater investment in infrastructure in general. When we're looking at the oil and gas companies and looking at some of the transition happens, there's going to be a lot of discussion on of course, CCUS. There's going to be a lot of discussions on, bringing in blue hydrogen and kind of reducing the carbon footprint of hydrogen development, how that can be used in a variety of industrial processes as well as transportation. But also we need to think about, especially when you're, for example, with BP, they have significant capabilities with offshore type development. How do we use and utilize those capacities to really improve our opportunities around offshore wind development? There's a lot of know-how there. There's a lot of engineering capacity, a lot of project management understanding of how you build these complex offshore type infrastructure. And so looking to oil and gas companies as they look to decarbonize and look at the energy transition to take those type of steps is going to be really key as well.
Just to key off of that, Cindy, I know you're having more details coming in September on BP's plans, but when you hear things like oil and gas knowledge and know-how and leveraging that in the clean energy space, can you comment on that at all? Is that something you're focusing efforts on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to kind of key off of something that Gavin just said. So we talked a little bit about sort of reimagining BP, and our new model actually focuses on 4 core capabilities: operations, customers, low carbon, and innovation. And then we were working with a team of integrators and enablers to actually create value from that. But just to build on Gavin's point, our operations are upstream and downstream and alternative energy, which brings all that capability together into one place so that we can apply the lessons that we've learned and the experiences, across traditional oil and gas opportunities, but also into new developments. So that's pretty exciting. Just a few business investments we've made recently. We just announced a 50-50 venture with Lightsource BP with $250 million financing for a solar project in Lemoore, Texas. We just acquired, or we announced last week that we're acquiring 50% of wind farm at Fowler Ridge in Indiana that we already operate. And of course, carbon capture, use, and storage will definitely be part of the levers that contribute to the realization of our ambition. One of the big ones that many of you will have heard about is Net Zero Teesside in the UK, which has the potential to be the UK's first commercial full value chain CCUS project. And we've joined that as a technical lead partner as part of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. So we're super excited about CCUS because it can achieve deep emissions reductions in parts of the economy where renewables are technically or not economically feasible. And we're super bullish on hydrogen. It's been big in places like Europe and the UK, Europe and Japan for a while, but it's starting to gain traction in the US. So just to close this one out, back to your question on approach, one of the phrases that we hear a lot externally and certainly internally we've been using is this sort of building back better. And so we want to be a part of the efforts to do that. And I think it just underpins why moving forward with an ambition of zero net carbon by 2050 or sooner is so important to all of us.
If I could stick with you for a moment, Cindy, and just put it in this current moment. Coronavirus has triggered a historic slump in demand for fossil fuels. There's also volatility earlier in the year created by the Saudi-Russia price war. In June, BP announced that it will cut up to $17.5 billion in value from its oil and gas assets and may be forced to leave some discoveries in the ground after its own forecast found the COVID-19 pandemic may affect the world's oil demand for potentially up to 30 years. The company said in a statement that the management team would review its plans to develop new projects in light of growing expectation that the global pandemic would accelerate the pace of transition to a lower carbon economy and green and energy system. So just to put it again in this moment, how is BP able to keep its focus on these new ventures, on spending in these new areas when its traditional business is going through this, rocky moment, and there's just a lot of chaos in markets overall, both in oil and gas and in clean energy? So how are you keeping your eye on the prize here?
And so I'll speak more as an individual here than as sort of on behalf of BP. But we have been taking steps, like we've recast our price deck. As you know, we wrote down some of our assets, and we are certainly, as part of the restructuring, looking to cut back and focus on the really crystal clear priorities. But as a company that's been traditionally oil and gas, we do know how to address the volatility of markets, and so we have the ability to cut back. We know how to respond when in down cycles, and we're pulling the levers that we traditionally use, as well as looking to the future at what are the new businesses, what will be potentially more stable businesses. There's sort of science and thinking that renewables might actually help us get a little bit out of the ups and downs that the oil and gas industry has faced for a while. So we're addressing that, like, kind of all of our comrades, and we're just focusing on what we believe could be the strongest business models for us moving forward and strengthening the corporate balance sheet in the meantime.
I guess, RJ, to go to you, are you seeing that play out in what oil and gas industry players are looking for in terms of stable returns from clean energy projects? And by that, I mean more renewable energy projects, energy storage, electricity sector, services. To what extent is that an opportunity for these firms to make money, basically, and get through this crisis?
Well, that's, of course, the big question, right? I think that even the national oil companies, the government-owned oil companies around the world are having to wrestle with that, not just the publicly traded IOCs. So the way we're thinking about this is, a lot of these companies have demonstrated the ability to successfully develop profitable, clean tech, renewable projects at the project level. But I think what Cindy's talking about is more enterprise level transformation, right? And I think that's where the market is, understandably still, I don't, skeptical is the right word, but still looking for more data and more detail. BP has actually provided more than most, because it does transform the whole organization. And we're moving from a model where the industry basically invested to acquire reserves, and the expectation was the value of the reserves would go up every year, and the companies that produce them efficiently were rewarded in the marketplace. That model is basically dead, right? I think that BP and some of the European peers understand that, are moving past it. The market, I think the patient capital, the longer term institutional investors will go with them on that journey. Those who are looking for short-term returns may be disappointed. But I think the challenge really is, how do you stitch it all together, right? Everything we've mentioned: wind, hydrogen, CCS, LNG, electric vehicle charging stations, solar, battery storage, right? How does that all integrate in the same way that the traditional upstream, midstream, downstream value chain for oil and gas existed? That's what everyone's still trying to figure out. But again, I think it's good that some companies at least are thinking about the total transformation at the enterprise level, not just kind of a project here or a project there.
Alex, I guess I'll put a similar question to you. How are you seeing the breakdown and focus between some of the things you mentioned, CCS, addressing methane leaks, efficiency, things that are within the traditional wheelhouse of an oil and gas company, versus investments in new areas like EV charging to, Shell became an electricity provider in the UK, things like that. How are you seeing the focus break down in your analysis?
Well, I'll say it's highly differentiated on both a company and a country level. Now, both of those types of measures, the sort of scope 1 and 2 emissions from own operations, as well as scope 3 from shifting towards a lower carbon portfolio of businesses overall, both of those types of measures will play an absolutely critical role in reducing emissions intensity of these companies and ultimately driving energy transitions forward down the line. I think scope 3 type of measures have gotten a lot of attention. But one thing we've found with our clients is there is tremendous potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in aggregate, focusing on scope 1 and 2. And one of the points I like to emphasize is that if we think of oil and gas value chains, sort of from well to wheels or burner tip, right, about 20% of the emissions is embedded in scope 1 and 2 for the production, transformation, processing, transport, et cetera, of those hydrocarbons to the end source. And we know that a lot of the measures that can help to reduce those emissions are some of the lowest hanging fruit, in terms of cost and ease to do, in terms of methane emissions, energy efficiency, a couple of the topics I mentioned before. So I think companies are rightfully focusing on a basket of both of those. And it sort of depends, right? For your European IOCs, what we're seeing is a real combination, because in many ways they have already pursued a lot of the scope 1 and 2 emissions reduction measures in the past. They have some of the lower kind of carbon intensity of production to begin with. And so inherently, with the push towards net zero in Europe, that they need to look towards scope 3 and diversify. Whereas national oil companies, who are the sort of largest producers fundamentally of oil and gas resources globally, they have a lot of headroom on the scope 1 and 2 emissions and can really significantly impact global greenhouse gas emissions with fairly modest investments. What we found is quite striking, actually, how cheap it ultimately is to have a big impact there. I think where there's more uncertainty is here in the U.S., right, among the U.S. majors and the independents. We've seen more of a focus so far on just the scope 1 and 2, less commitments around diversifying on their scope 3 emissions. But that may change going forward. For picking up with what RJ mentioned, the investor pressure is increasing on this, and investors are looking for what the long-term viability of the business model is for these companies, not just necessarily how can they have a dent in emissions in the short run.
And RJ, can I ask you to build on that? At what point, looking here partially through a political lens, because there's pressure coming from activists and folks in the clean energy and climate community to have oil and gas companies actually curb production? We're seeing some big, bold commitments from the oil and gas sector to reduce emissions. OGCI had an announcement this week, a group of oil and gas companies agreeing to cut their emissions, but production is not part of that. So I wanted to put it to you, this pricklier question of at what point does that enter the conversation, if ever?
Well, I think every year that goes by without meaningful government action on climate policy, the risk of a so-called inevitable policy response, where you have production curtailments in the context of deteriorating global climate and weather conditions that were mentioned earlier, that risk grows. So I think when you look at the impairments that the companies have announced, there's almost an implicit shutdown of production embedded in some of those announcements, that reserves that won't be developed under the current price outlook or demand outlook. But as far as shutting off existing fields, it may be interesting to assess whether some of the fields that have been shut as part of COVID, whether those maybe stay idled. I've heard that for one or two, but for maybe the oil sands a little bit here and there. But for the most part, I think most of that production has come back on and will be needed as the market rebalances 2021, 2022. So far, I don't think we've seen much evidence yet that there's pressure, but I think investors are worried that at some point, if there isn't enough steps being taken towards implementing the Paris Agreement, and we do have some kind of climate shock, that there could be a much more abrupt transition. And then there's some that simply feel that would be a more efficient path, right, to shut in production versus creating new sources of demand. So I would say there's a lot of uncertainty around this area for sure, and it does impact investor confidence in the outlook for the sector.
Thank you. Gavin, going back to you, we are still in the midst of a public health and economic crisis, but conversations have already started to turn toward resilience and, as Cindy mentioned, building back better and staving off the impacts of a future crisis, either like COVID or climate-fueled ones, perhaps. So how are you thinking about resilience in the Houston context or even nationally? How's that word factoring into the green stimulus discussions?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we've actually been actively involved with the city of Houston on its climate action planning efforts and its resilience planning efforts. And when you talk about resilience, it's there's a wide variety of concerns around that, as far as social resilience, economic resilience, climate resilience, infrastructure resilience, and so all those pieces are really needing to come together to some degree to make things work here. And so one of the key issues that we continue to run into, and especially in the context of COVID-19, is really looking at kind of community resilience and economic resilience for those that are directly impacted by a lot of this stuff. And we've had a lot of discussions about essential workers versus non-essential workers, and the impact that's happening on essential workers, and those are a lot of those that are involved with day-to-day operation of construction and implementation of large projects, and those that are really involved with kind of making the wheels spin for the economy and such, and to make sure that they have a continued opportunity to participate in the market, to have an opportunity to continue to have the jobs that are necessary to in order to take care of themselves, take care of their family, take care of their community, is going to be key. And we can't lose sight of that when we start talking about this transition that's happening there. It really needs to be a key focus to make sure that when we're talking about new technologies and we're talking about automation of things and improving efficiencies, that the people that are associated with this, that the people that are really driving the economy have an opportunity to allow things to move forward. And so I hope when we look at in the context of Houston, that as we talk about transition and talk about evolving our economy or changing our economy to some degree, that we're really serious about that, and we're really serious about making sure that everyone has an opportunity to move forward there. And a lot of that's going to be investment in our education system. A lot of that's both K through 12, as well as our trade schools, our colleges, our universities, making sure that there's that opportunity there, making sure we build out a kind of an innovation ecosystem. We recently had Greentown Labs come to Houston, join Houston, which is really going to really help with kind of the innovation ecosystem within Houston. But we need that type of activity to continue to happen as well. So we need the transition to happen that leads to decarbonization, but we also need to make sure that people that are essential to the economic growth and development of the city and of the state continue to have the opportunities to transition from if there needs to be a transition from the oil field, how does that transition happen, and to make sure we make that as equitable and as fair as possible for them and keep them in mind during this process.
Hey, Julie, can I add to that?
Please,
Houston perspective, as someone who lived in Houston for many years and has a lot of sympathy and affection for the city, sometimes it's easy to think about kind of despair in terms of energy transition and a just transition of oil and gas workers. And obviously, it's a cyclical industry. We've been through rounds of disruption. But for perspective, the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario, which is their pathway for 1.5 degree scenario, still has 68 million barrels a day of oil demand in 2040, which is based around about $600 billion a year of fossil fuels investment. And that's the low carbon scenario, right? So above that, it's actually much higher. So I think for Houston, my advice really is, in addition to everything that my colleagues are talking about here about the transition, what can Houston do to position itself to be a leader in producing the 68 million barrels we're still going to need in 2040, right? And I think investors will be looking for resources that are low cost, low risk, and low carbon on the oil and gas side. And I think many companies in Houston are taking advantage of the ecosystem there to look at how to produce fields along those lines, how to electrify the upstream, how to reduce the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, as was mentioned earlier. And so I think there is a long tail here for oil and gas. Gas I didn't mention as much, but even on the oil side, even in a peak demand world, you still have $600 billion a year of investment going in the sector. So that's probably something to keep in mind as well.
Cindy, I know you work a lot in the Houston area on these types of issues, so I'd love to get your thoughts. And we have a question from the audience, if you don't mind, just to build on this. We're talking about jobs still in the oil and gas sector, but Corey asks about potential opportunities to transition high-skilled workers into green energy jobs if they want them, pointing to layoffs that have already happened in the Houston area from Exxon, for instance. So how is BP thinking about not only the bigger question of jobs and resilience, but then this transition question? Are you taking folks from inside your own organization and moving them into greener areas of the business? Any insight you can provide would be great.
Okay, so Julie, I think to address the how do you transfer people around, we're really starting to get our arms around how transferable the skills are. So my background's in geology, and we talked to a lot of folks about, did I join the wrong industry and focus in the subsurface? So geology, petroleum engineering, reservoir engineering. And the truth is, as you really got into the planning and execution of these projects, there are going to be loads of roles for the scientists, engineers, the project developers that I think are fungible. And so it's really just kind of seeing the opportunities out there. So I think there's a great future for transferring the skills that you've learned, knowing your craft in oil and gas, and applying them to other projects. So I think then I'll come back to the first part of your question about the energy transition. And Houston's the energy capital of the world, and we want it to stay that way. To me, that means it's the home, the headquarters, and the intellectual center for all aspects of all forms of energy. So historically, this has been focused on oil and gas, but as the world's energy options grow, so does the expertise here in Houston. And we're seeing the commitment to that from the city. We've had a couple of references. Gavin talked about the city's climate action plan, and certainly at BP, it's very similar to ours, to be carbon neutral by 2050. And so we're really excited about Mayor Turner and the city's efforts, and we look forward to opportunities to collaborate in that area. Houston's business community is active and engaged. Bobby Tudor, who's the chair of the Greater Houston Partnership, has made energy transition his top priority, and he and Bob Harvey, JHP's president and CEO, have assured that the Houston community is focused and welcoming all forms of the energy business into Houston. So I think I'll kind of stop there. I can keep going on and on about the opportunities for Houston and priorities, but there are a lot of good things to share from this site.
Great. Turning to another set of audience questions. This is around carbon capture and sequestration. They're asking the panel to comment on short-term impact of COVID-19 on the ability for 45Q, the tax program, to drive CCUS projects. If you make less profit, you pay less tax. In theory, that mechanism would not be as effective. And in general, building another question, what is the potential for carbon capture and sequestration as part of this green mix? So maybe Alex, I'll go to you first on that one.
Absolutely. So I think the really important thing about 45Q is that the tax credit is transferable. And what we've seen work in renewables in the form of tax equity investment, of investors effectively pooling their resources, capturing that tax credit, and then using it against other tax liabilities elsewhere, is a similar type of model that can be used in 45Q. So it's really meant to be resilient through business cycles, and in effect, to effectively be, a cost of carbon. And that's really the remarkable thing I think about 45Q is for storage. It is a $50 per ton carbon price that the federal government has implemented. For utilization, it's $35 per ton. And so it is the farthest reaching, I would say, economic incentive globally for CCUS. And I think one that really will be resilient going forward. And I think the U.S., not just from sort of a short run perspective here, in terms of the stimulus for providing jobs for oil and gas sector workers. As Cindy was just talking about, this is a great space where you have a high transferability from the traditional oil and gas. I mean, it literally is dealing in the subsurface as well as all the surface level components here and the engineering capabilities, but is an opportunity as well to promote U.S. competitiveness in the sector going forward. We know from all of the modeling that carbon capture will need to play a incredibly central role to meeting well below 2 degrees or getting anywhere close to it, frankly. And I think the U.S. leading the way here on CCUS is not just good for an opportunity for the climate, but also for promoting global competitiveness.
Cindy, to turn back to you on that, how is BP thinking about carbon capture sequestration? And I want to add the caveat that this technology has been around for a while. It's still quite expensive. And, there's questions about just how much mitigation you can get at what cost. So just to put those tougher questions to you, what's the reality of what the outlook is?
Yeah, so I think RJ did a great job of sort of framing, that CCUS can, that we will continue to have oil and gas. And so I wanted to be really clear the way we think about it at BP and the way we talked about it in the National Petroleum Council carbon capture, use, and storage study that we just published this year is that CCUS is not the only answer, but it can actually play a critical part of the sort of all of the above solution. And, RJ mentioned the IEA Sustainable Development Solution. That shows that if we apply this sort of all the tools in the toolkit, CCUS could potentially address about 10% of the world's CO2. And so it's not the only answer, but it's a great answer because of what you said, Julia. We can do it today. We've got proven technologies. So the kind of great news is that we predict with the clarity that the IRS is providing on 45Q that we will see investments. There's still some questions out there, like project implementation date. I think most people are looking to see if that could be extended a bit more. But it's a great start, and so we're pretty bullish on CCUS. As I said, we've got a project in the UK. We'll have other projects globally, and kind of just tying it back into Houston, the Gulf Coast offers a great opportunity for carbon capture. We've got industrial gases up and down the coast. We've got fantastic storage opportunities. We've got saline reservoirs in the subsurface, both onshore and offshore, and also producing fields. The biggest area, of course, is the Permian, but there are some other areas as well. We're such an innovation center that the use part of carbon capture is being researched by these innovators who are, working in Houston, folks like Greentown Labs and others who are looking to create products from CO2, fuels, and fertilizer, and fun things like diamonds and carbon nanotools. Last point, CCUS doesn't only capture emissions from power generations, but it's also vital for decarbonizing cement and steel, where process emissions are actually pretty hard to abate. And sort of where else do you see so much cement and steel than Houston? So.
My wedding ring is actually a carbon captured diamond. So there you go.
Right, a spirit diamond. That's so cool.
There you go. RJ, I want to give you a pricklier political question. We're talking about a green stimulus. Here in the US, there's discussions of another round of stimulus, but it may be more targeted on, helping workers and families, not so much industries. We'll see how that plays out. But the point is a green stimulus is not on the immediate agenda as it looks like right now. So how do you see that entering the conversation? And again, to put it in the context, currently, oil and gas firms have benefited from the Paycheck Protection Program that was already passed by Congress earlier this year. There's been pushback among activists saying they received a lot of money, somewhere from $2.2 billion to $4.91 billion in loans, and potentially an additional $2 billion in other kinds of government support just in the wake of the pandemic. And that has no green elements attached to it. So to put it to you, what is the right way to approach a green stimulus that benefits the oil and gas industry's transition, given that there's tension around where government dollars go?
Yeah, again, I think you asked a prickly question. I'll give you a prickly answer. I think that if I were a U.S. oil and gas company, I would bypass the government and go directly to the private sector and not get, I live in Washington, make my live in Washington, but I wouldn't waste time in Washington, at least until after the election, looking for green dollars. So I would either go to the private sector or I would go to the European Union. Now, obviously, they're going to be funding projects mostly within Europe. Teesside was mentioned. There's a bunch of others like that. The question is, how much will that change under the Biden administration? There's certainly a very broad ambition to do a massive green stimulus with wind and solar, energy efficiency, electric vehicles, cash for clunkers, hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera. A lot will depend on what happens in Congress, right? If they can get control of the Senate, if they eliminate the filibuster rule, there's a lot of things that could happen to get some of this green spending moving forward. But then there would be the question of, would you start to see some backlash at the state level from industry and the courts, like we've seen with both Obama and Trump on energy policy issues? So I'm pretty cautious about the availability of public sector dollars. I think, frankly, when you mentioned the city of Houston's net zero goal, or different states in the U.S., there may be some interesting opportunities at the state and local level that might move faster than what happens in Washington. But generally speaking, I think that, again, because there's such an abundance of investors looking for projects in the private sector, I think there's plenty of capital out there without having to go through Capitol Hill.
Gavin, I know you're based in Houston, you focus there, but there have been a bunch of bills and proposals coming out of Washington. The House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis had its 500-page bill on a green stimulus. Joe Biden released his climate platform. Can you pull anything from those recent announcements and how they're factoring into your thinking about the green stimulus?
Need to unmute myself. So some of the, I think, things that we've been focusing on in that regard is really some of the efforts that are discussing kind of the RD, D, and D, the research, development, demonstration, and deployment investment that needs to happen. I think there's some key opportunities, especially within Houston, that are looking at how do we build that infrastructure and the ability to have that type of funding coming out of the Department of Energy or other types of federal agencies to help support that early stage research and development, as well as focusing on just the deployment and demonstration of those technologies as well. There's a lot more activity out of DOE right now looking at commercial validation and technology validation that I think Houston and the state in general can take advantage of. We have a very strong resource of universities and colleges and really strong innovation hub that's developing in Houston. So I think we need to start really taking advantage of that type of efforts and really kind of focus a lot of our desire of the green stimulus to really help us with that transition happening there. So I think anything that can help us on the early stage development and the commercialization of some of these technologies is going to be key for us.
And to answer a couple of questions that came up in the Q&A, what about nuclear? How does that factor into this green stimulus discussion, if at all, as you see it? Gavin.
I don't work whole lots in nuclear, so I can't really speak to that. I don't see it having, at this point, I don't see it having a huge opportunity right now, but I can't really speak to it too well.
All right. Well, we do have other questions in the Q&A. I'm sorry we don't have time to get to them, but hopefully we answer them at least in part through these other questions and answers. I really appreciate everyone tuning in. And since we're almost out of time, I'll hand it back to our host, Randy, to close us out here.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you all to those who helped put this event together, including David Yellen, Reed Blakemore, Roger Morales, Jasper Gilardi, Lauren Holland, Laura Goldberg, and Betsy Breyer. We hope that you all tune in for future Global Energy Center events, including a virtual fireside chat with Indian Minister of Petroleum and Natural Gas, Dharmendra Pradhan, next Wednesday, July 29th at 8 a.m. Eastern. And we hope you'll join us for our Veterans Advanced Energy Week, August 10th through 13th. Information about both these programs is available on the Atlantic Council website. And we hope that you'll also look out for the Center for Houston's Future's second annual Houston Low Carbon Energy Innovation Summit, which will be this fall. More information is coming soon. Thank you to all the panelists for joining us. This was a really remarkable conversation. And again, thanks to the audience for tuning in. Hope to see you all again soon.